It was the kind of place you only heard about in whispers. Hollowbrook, a village that didn't appear on any map, one that seemed lost in time. People talked about it, but only in hushed tones, never too loud, as if the very name might summon something unnatural. Ethan, an adventurer at heart, had always been fascinated by mysteries, and Hollowbrook had been calling to him for weeks. The stories were too strange, too compelling to ignore. They spoke of a village that vanished every year for a few weeks, its inhabitants completely disappearing without a trace, and then reappearing as if nothing had happened. No one could explain it. No one dared ask too many questions. The air was thick with fog as Ethan's car rolled through the narrow roads, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. It was late in the afternoon when he arrived at the edge of Hollowbrook. A feeling of unease crept up his spine. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, and not a single soul could be seen. The houses stood dark and still, their windows like hollow eyes, staring out into the empty street. He parked his car and stepped out, the silence almost suffocating. Ethan had heard the stories about people disappearing, the strange whispers in the wind, and the way the village seemed to erase itself. But seeing it, feeling it, was another thing entirely. His curiosity pushed him forward as he walked deeper into the village, looking for answers, or perhaps a way to explain the unexplainable. The more he walked, the stronger the feeling that something was wrong grew. He noticed an old man sitting on a rocking chair outside one of the houses, his face hidden in the shadows. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about this place. Why is it so quiet?" The old man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his eyes wide and unnaturally still, staring straight at Ethan. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Then, in a raspy whisper, the old man spoke. "You shouldn't have come. You should leave before it starts." The words hung in the air like a dark omen, and Ethan's curiosity pushed him to ask, "Start? What do you mean?" The old man slowly stood up, his movements stiff, as though his joints were made of old wood. "The village, it disappears. Once it does, you won't leave. No one ever does." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He didn't know whether the old man was just insane or if there was something to his warning. But the mystery of Hollowbrook was now deeper than ever, and Ethan wasn't one to back down easily. Ethan felt a wave of unease wash over him, but his determination to uncover the secrets of Hollowbrook pushed him to ignore the old man's cryptic warning. As the evening settled into night, the village grew even quieter, if that was possible. The dimming light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the empty streets, making the place feel like a forgotten dream. He decided to explore further, his instincts telling him that answers were just around the corner. The old man's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't let fear control him, not when the truth was so close. Walking down the main street, Ethan noticed how strange it was that there were no sounds, no animals, no distant chatter, not even the rustling of trees in the wind. The place seemed completely frozen in time. As he passed by a small cafe, he spotted a clock hanging outside. It was almost 8 p.m., but the hands of the clock seemed to be stuck, forever frozen at 6:15. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he realized that there was something wrong, something beyond just a missing village. The village wasn't stuck in time, it seemed to exist outside of it altogether. Suddenly, from behind a row of houses, a soft whisper broke the silence, so faint that Ethan almost thought it was just the wind. He froze, straining to hear. It was a voice, distant but unmistakable. His curiosity took over, and he followed the whispering sound, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The voice grew louder, more distinct, but still indistinguishable. It felt like it was beckoning him, leading him deeper into the heart of the village. As he rounded a corner, the sound stopped, leaving him in the thick silence once more. Ethan's breath quickened, and his pulse raced. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. Confused, he continued walking, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had begun to settle over him. He turned down a narrow alley and came across an old church, its door slightly ajar. A strange, inexplicable pull made him step toward it, and without hesitation, he entered. Inside, the church was dark, save for a faint light that seemed to emanate from the altar. The room smelled of dust and neglect, and the air felt thick with an ancient, oppressive weight. As he walked down the center aisle, the whispering returned, this time much clearer, as if coming from within the church itself. It was as though the walls were alive, holding the voices of those who had once inhabited this place. Ethan reached the altar, where an old, leather-bound book lay open. The pages were yellowed with age, but the text was still legible. He felt an overwhelming urge to read it, though he wasn't sure why. His hands trembled as he reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the whispers grew louder, echoing in his ears like a chant. The words seemed to twist and turn on the pages, forming symbols that made no sense. But one word stood out: Hollowbrook. Before he could read more, the ground beneath him suddenly shook. The lights flickered, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room seemed to close in on him, the whispers now almost deafening. Ethan turned toward the exit, but it was too late. The door wouldn't open, and the windows were completely blocked by a thick fog that had begun to roll in from the outside. Panic surged within him as he realized that the village was alive in ways he couldn't comprehend. Alive in a way that was far more sinister than he had imagined. Suddenly, the room fell silent again, and Ethan stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Was he trapped? Was this the beginning of the village's mysterious disappearance? Or was something far worse waiting for him just beyond the fog? He didn't know how much time had passed, but the eerie stillness had returned. His heart raced as he realized that he was no longer alone. Eyes, invisible yet unmistakable, were watching him from the shadows. Ethan's mind raced as the chilling silence enveloped him. Every fiber of his being screamed to escape, but his feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a combination of fear and curiosity. The eyes, he could feel them, watching him, studying him, but he couldn't see where they were coming from. The fog outside seemed to thicken, creeping in through the cracks in the church's walls, swirling around him like a living entity. His breath grew shallow as he slowly backed away from the altar, instinctively reaching for the door, but it was still as solid and unyielding as ever. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. He turned back toward the altar, his gaze falling on the old leather-bound book. It seemed to call to him, the faint glow around it pulsing like a heartbeat. He couldn't resist the pull any longer. With trembling hands, he picked it up again, flipping through the pages, trying to decipher the strange symbols and cryptic words. His eyes widened as he stumbled upon a passage that sent a jolt of cold terror through him. It spoke of a ritual, an ancient ritual that the villagers performed every year, when the village would disappear and reappear as if nothing had ever happened. The passage mentioned something even darker: the price of the ritual. It wasn't just the village that vanished, but everyone in it, erased from existence, never to return. The village was a prison, a place that existed in a timeless void, and the ritual was its key. Ethan's mind reeled as the implications hit him. The villagers weren't just disappearing, they were trapped in some otherworldly limbo, unable to escape, lost to the fabric of time itself. Hollowbrook didn't vanish by accident. It was a prison of its own making, and the ritual that the villagers had been performing for centuries was what kept them locked in this endless cycle. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that slammed against the church's windows, making the building groan and shake. He jumped, his heart leaping in his chest. The fog outside seemed to be swirling faster now, as though something was drawing closer. The atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just eerie. It was oppressive, like the very air was thick with something dark, something ancient. The whispers returned, but this time, they were clearer. They came from behind him, from the shadows in the corners of the church. Ethan turned slowly, his pulse hammering in his throat. The room was still empty, but the air felt heavy with an unseen presence. He could feel it, the weight of something watching, waiting. The whispers were now words, sharp and urgent, growing louder with every passing second. "You're not supposed to be here. Leave now, before it's too late." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. Leave? How? The door was still locked, and the windows were sealed tight. He had no way of knowing how long he had been in the church, but it felt like hours, maybe longer. The fear was starting to make him dizzy, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave without knowing the truth. The truth about the ritual, about the village, about everything. The book in his hands was the key, he knew it. But as he reached to turn another page, the ground beneath him trembled once more, this time more violently. The windows rattled, and the walls creaked as if they were about to crumble. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the church, drowning out everything else. Ethan's body tensed as he realized that the ritual had already begun. He wasn't just an observer now, he was a part of it. The fog outside had become a dense, impenetrable wall, pressing in against the church, closing in on him like the jaws of some terrible beast. He turned toward the altar, desperate for a way out, but the sight that greeted him froze him in place. The book had opened to a new page, and on it, there was a name written in blood. His name. A sharp, chilling laughter echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to come from all around him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with a palpable sense of dread. Ethan felt his heart race, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The village wasn't just alive, it was a living entity, and it had been waiting for him, pulling him in with an invisible thread. He was part of its twisted cycle now, its newest prisoner, and there was no escaping it. The door wouldn't open, and no one would come to save him. He was lost, just like the others. As the laughter grew louder, the fog swirled around him, the shadows growing deeper, more tangible. Ethan could feel the weight of the village pressing in on him, suffocating him, and in that moment, he realized the terrible truth. The silent village was not just a place, it was a curse, one that would never let him go. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very walls of the church were alive, closing in on him with every breath he took. Ethan's heart pounded violently against his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to run. But where could he run? The fog had swallowed the village whole, trapping him in an inescapable void. The whispers had now become a deafening chorus, a cacophony of voices that filled every corner of his mind. They were no longer just words, they were thoughts. His own thoughts twisted and distorted, urging him to accept his fate. "It's too late," they whispered. "You are one of us now." Ethan staggered back, his legs weak beneath him, the realization hitting him like a freight train. The book was still open in his hands, the blood-red name staring back at him. It was his name, he couldn't deny it. He was the chosen one, the one who had unknowingly entered the village at the wrong time, during the wrong season. The fog outside the church swirled violently, as if it had a mind of its own. It began to creep through the cracks, thickening inside the church like a living thing, curling around his legs and hands, dragging him down. Panic set in, and Ethan tried to shout, to call out for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had fallen over the village. No one would hear him. There was no one left. Hollowbrook had erased its own history, and Ethan had become a part of it. Just another name, just another soul lost to its curse. The realization was suffocating. His mind reeled, his body trembling as the shadows in the corners of the church began to shift. They moved closer, and as they did, he saw them. Faces. Faces of people he didn't recognize, but their eyes, those eyes, stared at him with a mix of sorrow and longing. They weren't alive, not in the traditional sense, but their presence was unmistakable. They were trapped here, just like him. Prisoners of the village, their souls bound to the fog that had consumed the land. Ethan's eyes darted around the church, desperate for an escape, but there was none. The doors still wouldn't open, and the windows were now completely opaque, covered in layers of thick fog that refused to let any light in. It was as though the village itself was holding him in place, refusing to let him go. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each passing second, and the floor beneath his feet felt like it was shifting, moving with a life of its own. The whispers were growing louder again, and the faces of the trapped souls began to move toward him, their mouths opening in silent screams. They were reaching for him, their hands outstretched as if begging him to understand their pain. Ethan could feel their desperation, their anguish. These were not just empty ghosts. They were people who had once been alive, who had once walked the streets of Hollowbrook, only to be swallowed by its curse. And now, he was part of them. He clutched the book in his hands tighter, his fingers numb from the pressure. The words were blurring before his eyes, but something caught his attention, something that hadn't been there before. A final warning, written in the same blood-red ink. Once the village takes you, there is no escape. You will be part of the cycle forever, forgotten by the world you once knew. Ethan's stomach twisted, his thoughts a blur of terror and disbelief. How could this be happening? How could the village erase everything, everyone? The curse wasn't just about disappearing. It was about becoming lost in time, becoming part of the village's never-ending loop. The villagers had never truly left. They had simply become one with Hollowbrook, their spirits trapped in an endless cycle of return and disappearance. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, and this time, it wasn't just the church. The entire village was shaking, as though it was coming alive, awakening after years of dormancy. Ethan could feel the walls shifting, the floor beneath him quaking, and the fog outside pressing in, suffocating him. He stumbled forward, his head spinning, and tried once more to open the door. It was no use. It was sealed tight, just as the villagers had warned. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging him to give in, to accept his fate. You can never leave. You belong here now. Hollowbrook is your home. The words echoed in his mind, and for a moment, he almost believed them. His vision blurred as the faces around him grew clearer, their expressions twisted in pain, their voices silent but pleading. He was no longer just an outsider, a visitor. He was one of them, a part of the cursed village, bound to its never-ending cycle of disappearance. In that moment of realization, Ethan understood that there was no escape. Hollowbrook had claimed him, just as it had claimed everyone before him. The fog outside began to swirl faster, and the shadows in the church seemed to reach for him, pulling him toward the altar. His body moved against his will, his feet dragging him toward the center of the room, where the book now seemed to glow with an unearthly light. The faces of the trapped souls surrounded him, their eyes wide with terror, as if warning him of what was to come. Ethan felt his body growing numb, his vision narrowing, and he knew that soon he would join them. His name would be erased, his existence forgotten, and Hollowbrook would claim another soul for its eternal curse. The church door slammed shut once again with a deafening thud, and Ethan's scream was lost in the fog that had now completely consumed him. The village had claimed him, and there was no escape. As Ethan's body trembled, his mind teetering on the edge of madness, a strange stillness settled over the church. The once deafening whispers faded into silence, leaving only the faint, hollow sound of his breath. He could feel the weight of the village pressing down on him, its curse slowly consuming him from within. His mind swirled in a vortex of confusion and dread, but a single, undeniable truth broke through the fog of terror. He was no longer just an observer. He was a part of Hollowbrook now, woven into the very fabric of its existence. The book, still clutched tightly in his hands, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Its pages, once blank, now glowed with dark, crimson symbols that writhed as though they had a life of their own. Each symbol seemed to call out to him, a beacon drawing him closer to something he couldn't comprehend. The faces of the trapped souls were no longer mere apparitions. They were flesh and bone, their eyes pleading with him, They had once been like him, human, full of life, but they had given in to the village, and now they were lost forever. Ethan staggered forward, compelled by an invisible force, and the book's pages turned, as though guided by some unseen hand. The words on the page began to blur, twisting into an ancient chant, a ritual that Ethan couldn't fully understand, but felt deep in his soul. The words called for a sacrifice, a final act that would bind him to Hollowbrook, sealing his fate. He looked up, and for the first time he saw it, the altar in the center of the church, surrounded by an ethereal light. The faces of the lost villagers circled it, their eyes filled with longing, their voices a chorus of silent wails. The altar was their prison, and it would soon be his too. Ethan's legs moved on their own accord, drawing him closer to the altar, the book's glow intensifying with every step he took. As he reached the altar, the voices of the trapped souls grew louder, their silent screams now echoing in his ears. Their torment was endless, a cycle that had begun long before he had arrived. The village had claimed them, and it would claim him too. His heart raced as he placed the book on the altar, feeling the weight of the curse settle upon him. There was no turning back. Hollowbrook had won. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. The fog outside had fully engulfed the village, and the last remnants of light were swallowed by the darkness. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a touch that sent a jolt of fear through him. But when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing. The room was empty, save for the book, the altar, and the swirling shadows that now filled the air. And then, with a single breath, the world shifted. The church, the village, the fog, it all disappeared in an instant. Ethan found himself standing in a vast, empty void, surrounded by nothing but darkness. The faces of the lost souls were gone, their cries silent. He was alone. But as he stood there, the words from the book echoed in his mind. "You will never be alone again." The curse had not taken him to death. It had bound him to something far worse. Ethan had become a part of the village's endless cycle, a soul trapped in time, forever lost. He glanced around the void, his mind screaming for release, but the darkness swallowed his thoughts. Hollowbrook would never let him go. As the silence of the void pressed down on Ethan, one question lingered in the air. Do you think Ethan's fate could have been avoided, or was he always destined to be a part of Hollowbrook's curse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more chilling tales. Stay tuned for the next mystery on the Horrible Hive.